Sarah had always found comfort in the quiet rhythm of her life. Her home sat on the outskirts of town, pressed against the dense woods that stretched for miles. It was peaceful, isolated, even, but that was how she liked it. The only companion she needed was Cooper, her golden retriever, a loyal shadow who had been with her through everything. Tonight, however, something was different. She first noticed it when Cooper came bounding through the back door, his tail wagging with an unusual fervor. His fur was dusted with dirt, his paws damp from the evening dew. But it wasn't his state that caught Sarah's attention, it was what he carried between his teeth. A baby shoe. It was small, barely the length of Sarah's palm, its once soft fabric now rough and stained. A thin layer of mud clung to the sides, but she could still make out the faded pattern of tiny blue stars dotting its surface. Sarah frowned. "Where did you get that, buddy?" she asked, kneeling to examine it. Cooper let out a soft whine and lowered his head, placing the shoe gently at her feet before backing away, watching her expectantly. Sarah picked it up, turning it over in her hand. It was old, that much was clear. The fabric was frayed at the edges, the sole worn thin. But that wasn't what unsettled her. It was the dirt, fresh, damp earth clinging to the material as if it had just been unearthed. A strange unease prickled at the back of her mind. There were no children anywhere near her home. Her nearest neighbors, the Whitmans, were an elderly couple who had never mentioned grandchildren. The closest family with kids lived nearly a mile away, across the main road. So where had this come from? She glanced at Cooper, who was still watching her, ears perked, tail flicking anxiously. Something in his eyes, an urgency she didn't understand, made her stomach tighten. She stood abruptly, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." She tried to shake off the unease, telling herself it was just an old shoe, a discarded remnant of some forgotten picnic or lost during a walk long ago. But as she wiped down Cooper's fur, her mind kept circling back to the shoe's condition. The damp dirt, the torn fabric, the way Cooper had brought it to her as if it meant something. By the time she went to bed, she had convinced herself it was nothing. That conviction didn't last long. She woke to a scratching noise. Groggy, she blinked at the ceiling, the soft glow of the moon spilling through her curtains. The scratching came again, low and insistent, followed by a faint whimper. "Cooper." Sarah swung her legs over the bed and padded toward the back door, where she found him sitting, his nose pressed against the wood, tail twitching. "What is it?" she murmured, rubbing her eyes. Cooper let out another soft whine and pawed at the door. Sarah sighed. "You just came inside. It's the middle of the night." But Cooper wasn't listening. He turned to her, eyes wide, pleading. Something was out there. A chill passed through her. She hesitated, then unlatched the door. Cooper bolted. She barely had time to slip on her boots before chasing after him, the night air crisp against her skin. The forest loomed ahead, its dark silhouette a jagged cut against the sky. Cooper ran with purpose, weaving through the trees with a determination that made her pulse quicken. "Cooper!" she hissed, trying to keep up. The underbrush crackled beneath her feet, the damp earth clinging to her soles. The further they went, the heavier the silence became. Even the usual hum of insects had vanished, swallowed by an unnatural stillness. Then Cooper stopped. He stood rigid, ears perked, staring at a spot just ahead. Sarah followed his gaze, and her breath caught. Nestled between the roots of an old oak tree, partially buried in the dirt, was a bundle of fabric. A blanket. Her fingers trembled as she crouched beside it. The fabric was stiff with grime, its faded pink hue barely visible beneath the dirt. A sick feeling curled in her stomach as she reached out, brushing away the earth. Something small tumbled out. A pacifier. Sarah's breath hitched. She sat back on her heels, staring at the objects in front of her, her mind racing. A baby's shoe. A blanket. A pacifier. This wasn't random. Her hands were clammy, her heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, Cooper let out a low growl. Sarah's head snapped up. The darkness pressed in around them, thick and suffocating. A branch snapped in the distance. She froze. Someone was watching. She could feel it, a presence lingering just beyond her sight. Her fingers clenched around the pacifier as her mind screamed at her to run. And then, from the depths of the forest, came a sound that turned her blood to ice. A whisper. Soft. Fragile. "Help me!" Sarah's breath strangled in her throat. Cooper bared his teeth, his growl deepening. The whisper came again, drifting through the trees, barely more than a breath. Sarah shot to her feet, grabbing Cooper's collar. Her instinct screamed for her to flee, to turn back, to pretend she had never seen this. But something inside her, something primal, something stronger than fear, kept her rooted. She swallowed hard, staring into the darkness. And then, barely audible over the pounding of her heart, the whisper came again. "Please help me." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. The whisper, so faint yet unmistakably human, hung in the air like a ghostly echo. Cooper stood rigid beside her, his body tense, muscles coiled. His growl had faded into silence, but she could feel the way his energy shifted. He wasn't just alert, he was waiting. Listening. Sarah swallowed hard, her grip tightening on his collar. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to turn back, to sprint home, lock the doors, and call someone, anyone. But someone was out there. Someone small. Someone who needed help. The pacifier in her palm felt heavier now, as if the weight of what she'd just uncovered had settled deep into her bones. Slowly, she exhaled and took a cautious step forward. "Hello?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely louder than a whisper itself. Is someone there?" The woods held its breath. No answer. A gust of wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she had imagined it. Maybe the exhaustion was playing tricks on her. Maybe this was just some cruel misinterpretation of the sounds of the night. But then, a rustling, soft, uncertain, like someone shifting in the underbrush. Sarah's throat tightened. She turned her flashlight toward the sound, the beam slicing through the darkness. Shadows twisted and stretched along the forest floor. The gnarled roots of trees jutted from the earth like skeletal fingers. And then, movement. A small shape, barely visible against the darkness, curled in on itself near the base of a tree. Sarah's breath caught. A child. She dropped to her knees, heart hammering. Hey, it's okay," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "I'm here to help." The child flinched at her voice, shrinking back against the tree trunk. A little girl. She couldn't have been older than 3 or 4. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks streaked with dirt. She was wearing pajamas, thin fabric smudged with mud and leaves clinging to the hem. Her bare feet were raw, scraped and red. Sarah's stomach twisted. How long had she been out here? She set the flashlight down carefully, angling it away so it wouldn't blind the child. "My name is Sarah," she said softly, extending her hand. "What's your name?" The little girl didn't answer. She hugged herself, tiny fingers gripping the fabric of her pajamas. Sarah felt Cooper shift beside her. The moment his golden fur came into view, the girl's eyes widened. "Doggy," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken. Sarah's chest ached. "Yeah," she said, offering a small smile. "That's Cooper. He's a good boy." Cooper inched forward, his movements slow, deliberate. He sniffed the air, his ears flicking forward as he studied the child. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he lay down. It was an invitation. The little girl hesitated for a moment, then reached out with trembling fingers. She brushed them against Cooper's fur. So light, so hesitant, as if she wasn't sure he was real. Then, a hiccuping sob racked her tiny frame, and she buried her face in his coat. Sarah's heart clenched. Who was this child? Where had she come from? And why was she out here alone? She took a slow breath, choosing her next words carefully. "Sweetheart, are you lost? Do you know where your mommy or daddy are?" The girl stiffened. Then, barely above a whisper, "Bad man." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The night seemed to close in around her, the silence pressing heavier. She swallowed, forcing her voice to stay steady. "What do you mean, honey? What bad man?" The little girl only shook her head, curling deeper into Cooper's fur. Sarah's mind raced. A child, wandering alone in the woods. A baby's shoe, a pacifier, a blanket, buried. And now this. Her instincts screamed that they were no longer alone. She turned her head sharply, scanning the shadows. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. Cooper let out a low growl. Sarah's stomach flipped. Something was out there. And it wasn't friendly. A snap, somewhere behind her. Sarah shot to her feet, yanking the flashlight up. The beam wobbled as she swung it wildly, illuminating nothing but trees and darkness. But she knew. They were being hunted. She could feel it. And suddenly they were out of time. She scooped the little girl into her arms, her tiny body trembling against Sarah's chest. "We need to go," she whispered, glancing at Cooper. "Now." Cooper didn't need to be told twice. He turned sharply, pressing close to Sarah's side as they started moving, fast. Branches snagged at her sleeves. The wind howled through the trees, masking the sound of their hurried footsteps. But behind them, a presence. Heavy. Moving. Sarah didn't dare turn around. She just ran. Heart pounding. Breath ragged. Cooper snarled, deep and guttural, the sound of an animal ready to fight. And then, a voice. Low. Sharp. Not the child's. Not hers. "You shouldn't have found her." The air turned to ice in Sarah's lungs. She stumbled, nearly dropping the child. That voice. Close. Too close. A shadow loomed at the edge of her vision, just beyond the reach of her flashlight's glow. Sarah's fingers clenched around the little girl. And then, a hand. A pale, dirty hand reaching out from the darkness. She sucked in a breath. And ran faster. Sarah's lungs burned as she ran, her heart hammering against her ribs. The little girl clung to her like a lifeline, small hands fisted in Sarah's sweater. Behind them, the presence loomed, moving swiftly, deliberately. Cooper was a blur at her side, his ears pinned back, his breath ragged with exertion. He wasn't running away, he was running with her, shielding her, ready to fight if needed. The trees felt endless, shadows stretching in all directions. Every branch overhead clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. The wind carried a whisper. No, not the wind. A voice. "Come back." The words slithered through the darkness, laced with something sickly sweet, something unnatural. Sarah's pulse slammed in her ears. She didn't stop. Didn't dare. The forest thinned ahead, the faint glow of the streetlights just beyond the trees. Safety. Civilization. A chance. She pushed forward, legs screaming, the little girl whimpering softly against her shoulder. Then, a sharp crack. Footstep. Heavy. Running. Not hers. Not Cooper's. Not the child's. Someone else was here. Sarah's breath caught. She twisted, barely catching a glimpse. A figure, tall and thin, emerging from the shadows. Clothes tattered. Face obscured. But the way he moved, wrong, like a predator savoring the chase. And he was closing in. Cooper let out a fierce snarl, his golden fur bristling, his body lowering into a defensive stance. His usual warmth, his gentleness, was gone. In its place, something primal. The man stopped. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Sarah's chest heaved. The little girl trembled, her breath hot against Sarah's neck. Then, a smile. Barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have taken her," the man said, voice low, grating. "She doesn't belong to you." Sarah's fingers tightened around the child. Every cell in her body screamed to run, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "Who are you?" she demanded, hating the way her voice wavered. "What do you want?" The man tilted his head. "She's mine." The little girl whimpered. Sarah's stomach turned. "Liar," she spat. The man took a slow step forward, his movements eerily deliberate. "She was left for me," he said, his voice almost amused. You weren't supposed to find her. Left for him. The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. What did that mean? Who had left her? Before she could process, before she could react, the man lunged. Cooper moved faster. A snarl ripped through the air, raw and vicious. The golden retriever collided with the man, teeth flashing, claws scraping against fabric and skin. The man let out a guttural hiss, stumbling back. Run! Sarah gasped, gripping the child tighter. She turned and bolted, her legs burning as she crashed through the last stretch of trees. The street lights were so close now, flickering against the dark. Almost there. Almost safe. Behind her, Cooper growled, a furious, wild sound. Then, a sharp yelp. Sarah's heart stopped. She twisted just in time to see the man shove Cooper away, his hand buried in the dog's fur. Cooper staggered, his paws skidding in the dirt. The man locked eyes with Sarah, and he smiled. Something inside her snapped. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, grabbing a fallen branch from the ground, and swung. The wood cracked against the man's side, sending him stumbling. He let out a strangled sound, eyes flashing with something dark. Sarah didn't wait to see if he'd recover. She turned and sprinted toward the road. The pavement was rough beneath her feet as she burst from the tree-line, her breath ragged. Headlights flashed in the distance, a car. She staggered into the street, waving frantically. The car screeched to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with wide, startled eyes, threw open the door. Jesus Christ, what's going on? Sarah barely had time to answer before Cooper came barreling out of the woods, his fur bristling, his breath heavy. But the man, the thing, was gone. Vanished into the night. The child in Sarah's arms let out a choked sob, burying her face in her shoulder. Sarah tightened her hold, her pulse still a frantic drumbeat in her ears. This wasn't over. Not yet. She turned to the driver, her voice raw. Call the police. The flashing red and blue lights painted the trees in eerie hues, the rhythmic wail of sirens piercing through the quiet night. Sarah stood on the side of the road, her arms wrapped tightly around the little girl, whose tiny body still trembled against her chest. Cooper sat by her side, his ears pinned back, his golden fur ruffled and dirt-streaked. He was exhausted but alert, his deep brown eyes locked onto the darkened tree line as if expecting the man to re-emerge at any second. Two officers stepped forward, their faces serious, scanning the scene. "You're the one who called this in?" the taller officer asked, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Sarah nodded, her throat dry. "There was a man in the woods. He was after her," she said, tightening her grip on the child. "I don't know who he is, but he said she was left for him." The officer's jaw clenched. His gaze flickered to the little girl, then back to Sarah. "Let's start from the beginning." Sarah took a shaky breath and told them everything, Cooper finding the baby shoe, the buried pacifier, the girl's whisper of "bad man," and finally, the horrifying encounter in the woods. The second officer knelt in front of the little girl, keeping his voice gentle. "Sweetheart, can you tell us your name?" The girl's lip quivered. She shook her head, pressing her face deeper into Sarah's sweater. The officer looked up at Sarah. "She won't talk." "She only said a few words," Sarah whispered. "But she's terrified." The first officer turned toward his radio. "Dispatch, we have an unidentified minor, approximately 3 to 4 years old, found alone in the woods. Requesting immediate CPS involvement." Sarah's stomach twisted. The thought of this little girl being shuffled through the system, alone and frightened, made her heart ache. "What happens now?" she asked. The officer sighed. "We'll run a missing child report, see if anyone has reported her. But until we can confirm where she belongs, she'll be placed in protective custody." Sarah hesitated, then glanced down at the child in her arms. She had stopped crying, but her grip on Sarah hadn't loosened. "You can't just take her somewhere unfamiliar," Sarah said, her voice firm. "She's already scared out of her mind." The officer hesitated. "I understand. But we have procedures. Then let her stay with me. The words were out before Sarah could second-guess them. Both officers exchanged looks. That's not how this works, ma'am, the taller one said carefully. There's a process for this sort of thing. But I found her, Sarah interrupted. She trusts me. Look at her. They did. The child clung to Sarah like she was the only safe thing in the world. The second officer exhaled, rubbing his temple. We'd have to check with CPS, but it's not unheard of, at least for the short term. He glanced at Sarah. Are you sure about this? Sarah nodded without hesitation. Yes. Cooper huffed softly, as if agreeing. The officers stepped away, speaking quietly into their radios. Sarah rocked the little girl gently, whispering soothing words even as her own mind spun. Who was she? Where had she come from? And most chillingly, who had left her out there? ####. The next few hours were a blur. CPS granted Sarah temporary custody pending an investigation. The officers scoured the woods but found no trace of the man who had pursued them. No footprints. No discarded clothing. Nothing. It was as if he had never been there at all. But Sarah knew better. She could still hear his voice in her head. Asterisk, she was left for me. Asterisk. ####. Back home, Sarah tucked the little girl into the guest bed, brushing the hair from her face. She had finally fallen asleep, her tiny fingers curled into the blanket. Cooper lay beside the bed, his head resting on his paws, watching her with quiet vigilance. Sarah sat on the edge of the mattress, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. She had so many questions, but for now, one thing mattered above all. The girl was safe, at least for now. But somewhere out there, in the depths of the night, someone was still watching, waiting. And Sarah knew this wasn't over. Not yet.